Good evening to all our attendees joining. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes and then we'll begin. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Tyler Dallas, and I'm a legal researcher for the Cape South African Jewish Board of Deputies. With me is Stuart Diamond, the Executive Director of the Cape SAJBD, and together we will be moderating this evening's webinar. We are so excited to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Sharon Nazarian, but I first want to ask our attendees to please type any questions you have into the Q&A box, which you will find at the bottom of your screen, into the chat box, which you will find at the bottom of your screen, as we will be reserving some time at the end of this webinar to allow Sharon to answer some of them. I would also like to note that Stuart and myself have been experiencing some network issues in our area. So if at any point we are frozen or you can't hear us, please let us know by typing it into the chat box and we will try to fix it as quickly as possible. Sharon, thank you for being here tonight. Sharon is the Senior Vice President of International Affairs at ADL and heads ADL's work in fighting anti-Semitism and racial hatred globally, including in Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East, and oversees ADL's Israel office. She joined ADL in 2017, and prior to that was active in academia, philanthropy, and foreign policy. He studied at the University of Southern California, double majoring in journalism and international relations, and going on to receive her master's and PhD in political science. She is president of the Y&S Nazarian Family Foundation, which promotes education as a catalyst for societal change, and with a regional office in Israel named the Ima Foundation. She is also the founder of the Y&S Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at the University of California in LA, and chair of its advisory board. Sharon taught as an adjunct professor at UCLA in the Department of Political Science, is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, and sits on a number of foreign policy boards. Sharon will be speaking to us about the impact of the recent US election on Jewish and other minority communities, with reference to the rise of anti-Semitism globally, and on what this new presidency may bring for US-Israel relations. The Cape SAJBD has a long-standing relationship with ADL. We have partnered together for the last 2 years to bring the Campus Impact Network to Jewish students in the Western Cape, which aims to empower them with the means to respond strategically and confidently to any form of anti-Semitism they may encounter. This event was unfortunately halted this year due to the pandemic. ADL has also continued to make their resources and experienced team of professionals available to us for collaborations, best practices, and innovations to advance the way we tackle anti-Semitism and discrimination in the Western Cape. Sharon, on behalf of the Cape SAJBD, I want to say it is an absolute honor having you here, and with that, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you, Tyler, so much, and hello to all of you. It's so wonderful to be reaching you in Cape Town, here in Los Angeles. We are worlds apart, and yet, thankfully with Zoom and this pandemic, probably one of the silver linings is that we can all reach one another easily, and hopefully we can communicate. It's really thrilling for me to be with you. I want to take this time to send your warm regards from the whole ADL family to all the community in Cape Town and across South Africa. And I hope I get to visit soon once we're allowed to fly again. So today I'm with you in thinking about, here we go. Where are we today in America post-election? And to say a few words about ADL. ADL was established 107 years ago. We are probably one of the primary American Jewish organizations that was established with two very clear missions, and that is to fight I'm ahead of myself here, let's go back, to fight against anti-Semitism and the defamation of Jewish people, and to secure just and fair treatment for all. So this dual mission has guided us from day one in 1913 when we were founded, and till this day, it is really our clear moral guidance as an organization to where we put our energy and where we try to bring influence and impact. My team, the International Affairs team, is responsible for the work of ADL outside the US. ADL's primary footprints in the US is across 25 offices in major cities in the United States. So everything that we do outside the US is handled by the International Affairs team. And we try to bring the same best practices, the same advocacy that ADL does in the US to the service of Jewish communities around the world, making sure that as much as we can, we help not only the protection, but support of Jewish communal life literally around the world. And through our products and through our services, through our know-how, whether it's in the education realm, in law enforcement trainings, in advocacy, in fighting online hate, in all those best practices that we've acquired over the century, we try to put them at the disposal of Jewish communities and other vulnerable communities around the world. So today I've been asked to speak a little bit about the elections that we just had here in the United States, and to give you a little bit of perspective of our analysis of it and where we think the Biden administration will take some of the issues that we all care about. So first and foremost, the campaign was bitter and very divisive. I think many of you have followed some of the news coming out of the US, because this really truly felt like a global election. I could tell you as I speak with heads of state around the world, foreign ministers, ambassadors, they all conveyed to me through the campaign process that their eyes were very, very clearly glued to the US elections. And they felt that this was really a pivotal election, not just for American citizens, but truly for the global community. And reacting to what the last 4 years of the Trump administration has really meant to the US role globally. So this was a real election of heightened interest around the world. The result was, to, in our assessment and most assessments, that there was a clear victory for Biden and Harris ticket, both in terms of the popular vote and the electoral vote. There is consensus now that this was a legal and clear victory for that ticket. The election saw an unprecedented turnout as people were able to vote both in person and by mail because of the pandemic. And so this was probably the most highly voted election in American history for those reasons. Despite serious concerns that there appeared to be no major irregularities with the voting process or with the counting of ballots, unfortunately, we're still hearing the Trump administration sharing some of those concerns and continuing to argue that the votes need to be counted. There's some legal proceedings that have now initiated. But to tell you honestly, there is consensus now in the US that all those legal proceedings really have very little evidence behind them, so will not be successful in courts. And that hopefully at some point soon, the Trump administration will come to the place where, with Republican leadership behind them, to feel that they need to accept the results of the elections. The Democrats retain control of the House, and the Senate is yet to be decided, because both Georgia Senate races are facing a runoff in December, and the Democrats need to win both to regain control of the Senate. There's still continued concern, not only about decisions that President Trump has made even yesterday regarding firing the Secretary of Defense, removing some of the civilian leadership in that department, in that ministry. And so there are still concerns about what will the next period between now and Inauguration Day will hold, and what kind of decisions will President Trump make in this interim period. The good news is that President-elect and Vice President-elect Harris are moving ahead with steps to form the transition. The transition has been already formed. It's been staffed, and heads of state have already congratulated the president-elect, and therefore, so movement is ahead. There is movement in that regard. So next, really turning to the issues that we care about at ADL, and that is really about fighting extremism. Anti-Semitism remains an ongoing concern, and both here in the US and internationally, Biden has stated that he decided to run for president following the Charlottesville neo-Nazi march. You all know and saw that, where people chanted, "Jews will not replace us." He's made fighting hate and extremism and for racial justice really a prime issue on his campaign. And we hope that he'll continue to pay close attention to that as he forms his government. During the campaign, we saw numerous examples of extremism and anti-Semitism seep into the American elections, which really concerned us at ADL. During the campaign, we saw President Trump, for example, telling the Proud Boys, or at least messaging through one of the debates, to stand down and stand by. And the reason we know that that's really impactful is because we monitor all the sites of these extremist groups like the Proud Boys, and we saw the reaction that they showed to that phrase coming from President Trump during one of the presidential debates. So by the very fact that they saw this as a vote of confidence that the president is messaging them directly to say, stand down and stand by, was a clear, it energized them and it gave them the vote of confidence that the president is with them and therefore aligned with what we consider an extremist group here in the US. And just the other day, we saw that former Republican Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, push a conspiracy theory that Jewish billionaire George Soros helped to finance and steal the 2020 presidential election for Joe Biden. So these themes have unfortunately been pretty prevalent in the campaign, and even to this day after the election are still being used by spreading conspiracies and really enabling and emboldening extremist groups on the side. So this is something that ADL has been very concerned with, and really we've been raising the alarm about it, and we're hoping that as we step into the new government with President Biden taking control on January 20th, we'll continue to monitor these, because these groups will not go away. They feel emboldened in some ways, and with the Biden government, will feel that their job is only beginning. So there's real concern on this part. So to really go to a specific organization or group, extremist group that has come out of this election cycle, named QAnon, this conspiracy-minded group that started very much in the fringes, and this electoral process has brought them to the forefront and mainstreamed them, is a group that really has been pivotal in looking at President Trump as their leader and engaging in their conspiracy theories with this notion of a ring of child pornography and coming together to take over our US government. This is an extremist group that is not only now prevalent in the US, but as now we've seen footprints in Germany and in the UK. And so the phenomena that we're monitoring here is the internationalization and the export of American extremist ideologies like QAnon to the world. And so one of the things that we ADL are really intent on bringing attention to is that hate no longer knows any borders. That when you have groups such as these functioning in certain countries, they have every means available to them to connect and to coordinate and to partner with other like-minded groups across the world. And this internationalization of extremist ideology is truly a global threat that faces all of us. And so we can no longer have the luxury of thinking only, oh, we're only worried about the groups in our own countries, because they're continuing to collaborate, to mimic, to live stream their unfortunate attacks. And we see that language from writings that they leave behind after an attack in their manifestos are lifted up, used as inspiration by others, such as we saw in Christchurch, we saw it in Charlottesville, we saw it in Pittsburgh. The same ideology and language is now being replicated, used by others in other countries to also perpetrate acts of violence. So the phenomena that we are seeing is continuing to grow. And in this campaign, QAnon really went from a very fringe organization to mainstream. So much so that we do have one member of Congress in Georgia who won with QAnon ideology openly out there. So this is something that we are very, very concerned about. Okay, next. So the tool that has enabled extremist groups, such as I just mentioned, QAnon and others, really amplify their hateful message, we all know, is social media. And ADL has been really at the forefront of initially working with social media platform companies. We established our Center for Technology and Society in Silicon Valley about 5 years ago. And being on the ground in the Valley, we felt that at the beginning, we needed to work together with Facebook, with Twitter, with all the major social media companies to come up with solutions of how do we combat hate online. We looked through machine learning, through artificial intelligence, doing co-design with engineers at these media companies. And we reached a point here in 2020 that we said enough is enough. And we felt that at this point, we had to change our posture into a more aggressive, offensive posture vis-a-vis the platforms, because we realized after almost a decade of advocacy, of telling them that you need to be part of the solution, we just did not see enough results. So in 2020, we started our first campaign specifically targeting Facebook called Stop Hate for Profit, where we did an advertising pause. We asked all over 1,000 global companies and corporations, brands you're all familiar with, from Verizon to every common brand you can think of, automobile companies, medical, all the large corporations of the world participated in a 1-month pause from purchasing advertisement from Facebook. So our goal was to make them aware that their algorithms that push extremist groups, their ads that include extremist language and extremist ideology, these can no longer continue. And just because there is a First Amendment, it does not mean that they have to allow hateful rhetoric and language on their sites. They are private entities, and just like any sector of the economy, whether it's the automobile industry or the pharmaceuticals, there are safety measures that are expected of those sectors for the protection of citizens. So too, social media companies need to input safety measures for their users so they're not exposed to, and in fact, actually fed extremist ideology and hate. So the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, we deemed very, very successful. We saw a hit on their bottom line. Of course, it was only for a month, but it was really to kind of give a wake-up call to all the companies and not just Facebook. We saw Twitter react, we saw others react, and we were very happy when Facebook took the decision to really now brand Holocaust denial as an acceptable language. We're very thrilled with that. We felt that we really, were part of that conversation, and we, bore pressure on Facebook to do that. So there is some movement, which is positive, but still we all know there is so much more they need to do. And they're still not doing it at the pace that's demanded. And this campaign, this election campaign, really reflected the amount of hateful ideology that continues to live on social media, accessible to all, and in fact being fed. Sorry, going backwards. So let's turn to the upcoming Biden administration and some of the issues that we care about together. As far as Israel is concerned, we at ADL feel that we know President-elect Biden. President-elect Biden has had a long history in the Senate, a long record of a pro-Israel stance. We liken it probably ideologically to President Clinton, very similar. We think that the direction for US policy toward Israel is a positive one, while of course President Trump had a very close relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and in some ways stepped away from being kind of an unbiased deal maker, which the role the US had always tried to play. President Trump definitely moved away from that and really showed very openly its very favored position for Israel when it came to Palestine-Israel issues. We do feel that President Biden will try to step back and go to more a traditional role for the US, to be more of an honest broker. But there is very little concern that the left flank of the Democratic Party, which through the campaign had raised issues of more criticism of Israeli policy, of holding up American aid, military aid to Israel, none of that really manifested itself in the final platform. And President-elect Biden was very intent that none of those kind of more extreme positions of the left flank of the Democratic Party would be reflected in the platform or in his policy priorities going forward. So we feel that both President-elect Biden and Vice President Harris will continue a very strong relationship with Israel. And so we are very happy about that. We don't think, for example, that he will try to move the US Embassy from Jerusalem. As I said, military aid will be maintained, so we're not really concerned about that. As far as the changes to approach to the Palestinians, there will be some changes that we foresee. We think that, President-elect Biden will feel that the Abraham Accord that was reached between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain were very positive steps, definitely reflecting a changing dynamic in the Middle East. But we think that President Biden will want to address the fact that the Palestinians were completely left out. And therefore, we'll try to find ways, again, going back to a more traditional role for the US, of bringing the Palestinians back to the peace table and finding yet again ways for Israel and the PA to reach some sort of a peace agreement. We also have to say that there's already been public conversations by President-elect Biden and Vice President Harris that they would resume some assistance to the Palestinians. Obviously President Trump had really slashed most of the funding to UNRWA and to other UN agencies that provided support for the Palestinians in PA and in Hamas. President Biden will probably try to redress some of that and restart some of that. Hopefully, it'll be linked though to some change in behavior. We at ADL are very concerned about textbooks, for example, and language of incitement. That's been a huge issue with the Palestinian Authority textbooks that really do include anti-Semitic and really hateful language for Palestinian children. We at ADL will continue to advocate for changes in those textbooks. So there's work to be done, but we do think that President Biden will try to go back to more of a traditional honest broker role and see if bringing the two sides back to a peace table is possible. Of course, now with the leadership in the Palestinian Authority is very complicated. They don't really have a strong leadership in place. With Mahmoud Abbas aging, with no real leadership lineup, nothing has been made public in terms of what he thinks will be someone next in line for that position. So we know that's probably not very realistic, and I think President-elect Biden realizes that, but I do think that there will be a move, step backwards towards that more honest broker role than the Trump administration had done. Iran is another issue that we at ADL are really focused on. Not only am I an Iranian American myself, with a lot of concerns that the Iranian regime has perpetrated not only domestically towards its own citizens, regionally, obviously in the Middle East, Iran is the primary bad actor, geostrategically posing threats to all its neighbors, to Israel, obviously, with footprints in Iraq, in Syria, Lebanon, obviously, but also looking at Iran's role globally. I mean, looking at Latin America, for example, with the Hezbollah being its main player and advocate, really having nefarious roles around the world. So we're looking to the Biden administration. Obviously, the Trump administration used a maximum pressure approach towards Iran, huge sanctions, targeted sanctions against key figures in the Iranian IRGC. So we think that obviously President Biden has talked a little bit about looking at the nuclear deal, the JCPOA, stepping back into it possibly where President Trump had stepped out of it. We think that President Biden will use that as a symbolic message to our European allies more than anything, to say that we're once again coming back into the fore of working together in a multilateral way with our European allies. So the JCPOA might be the vehicle where President Biden might do that. Now, we at ADL, we don't take specific positions on nuclear issues. We're not nuclear scientists. We can't really make assessments on that. We did when President Obama signed on to the JCPOA initially. We felt that it was not strong enough an agreement. We felt it didn't address all the other issues like the ballistic issues and other threats that the Iranian regime poses to its own neighbors. But once it was signed, we really felt that it's better to have it than not to have it. And then how do we go into making it stronger? So where our advocacy will lie now with the Biden administration is to, if there is a step back into JCPOA, how do we strengthen it? How do we look at the sunset clauses? How do we look at other behavior of Iran in the region that should be brought under and should be addressed? So we're hoping that the maximum pressure campaign of President Trump will not really, the foot will not come off the gas there, but we do believe in the multilateral approach. We do think it's important to have Europeans on board with the US, looking together on how to continue to bear pressure on a regime that is really one of the most nefarious actors now in the global scene. And so that will be where ADL's focus will be. Now, just to tell you again, because of our DNA, my team puts a lot of focus also on what the regime is doing internally to its own citizens, especially when it comes to religious minorities, sexual minorities, as well as women. So we at ADL, I launched 2 years ago a task force on Middle East minorities, where I have experts from around the region, from around the Middle East, really researching, writing, and advocating on behalf of various minority groups, whether it's the Copts in Egypt, or it's the Baha'i faith in Iran, or it's the Yazidis in Syria and Iraq. So we at ADL feel that we do need to continue to speak on behalf of vulnerable communities that are being repressed by their own regimes. And specifically in Iran, we're looking at the Jewish community, as I said, the Baha'i community, the Christian community, especially Christian converts, are really miserably treated by the regime. The LGBT community in Iran and across the Middle East, we advocate on their behalf. So we at ADL feel that is kind of an authentic space for ADL to advocate and to bear pressure globally on the regime. So whether it's going to our European allies or even going to some of our Asian partners like Korea and Japan that have a lot of influence in Iran, how do we get them really paying attention to the human rights issues? I don't know if you all noticed that also in the past several months, the regime has executed one athlete that was, was a world-renowned wrestler. He was put to death. And right now, as we speak, a paraplegic bodybuilder is in jail and may be executed just for the very fact that he said, how is it that all the mosques are open and yet we as athletes cannot gather because of COVID and to exercise? So he literally just posed the question about the hypocrisy of some of the COVID policies of Iran. And Iran has been hit very hard, by the way, by COVID. So he's now under threat of execution. So Iran is a huge issue that we think at ADL we should continue. And by the way, I haven't even touched on the anti-Semitism. The rhetoric comes out of the leadership, the Holocaust denial. All those are the reasons why Iran will be a main focus for us with the Biden administration, and we'll continue to share those expertise with the Biden team. Now, as far as the other foreign policy shifts, you can think what they are already. Obviously, we at ADL will continue to advocate for US foreign policy towards other countries and to highlight democratic values and human rights, as I just mentioned. We think that there should be a tougher posture on Russia and Putin. This has been a very controversial issue here in the US. given the last elections and the role of disinformation, given the role of Russian interference in our last election. So there's really a reckoning that needs to take place still. Rejoining the Climate Peace Accord, Paris Climate Accord, excuse me, is another priority for the Biden administration. And I think rejoining the World Health Organization and other UN bodies, all these steps that the Trump administration had stepped away from, we think that the Biden administration is very interested in coming back and showing that the US is back in its role, traditional role as a leader of the global democratic world, as a multilateralist, and working closely with our allies. We think that the Biden administration will really want to emphasize that. And China will be a question mark. We're not sure exactly. There hasn't been a lot of talk about the Biden administration's path to China and how will it really address that. So finally, ongoing threat of global anti-Semitism and extremism. We saw just last week in Vienna, was it 2 weeks ago? I have no sense of time anymore, where there was a major ISIS attack in downtown Vienna, right at the heart of the Jewish community quarter of Vienna, where the attack started in front of the synagogue. Thankfully, the synagogue was closed and not populated at that time, but an ISIS sympathizer went ahead and really caused mayhem in downtown Vienna. These issues of extremism continue to be of concern to us, and these are issues that ADL will be bringing to the Biden government in every avenue that we have. We will continue to not only look at domestic issues such as domestic terrorism, and how do we move ahead with designating terrorist groups within the US, such as white supremacist groups that have already perpetrated acts of crime against synagogues and others, labeling them actually as a terrorist organization. But also through my team, we will continue our advocacy internationally that steps that should be taken to protect Jewish communities, whether it's physical safety or the ability of Jews around the world to live openly and safely as Jews. We know that both in South Africa, in Europe, and in other places like Chile, for example, more and more Jewish citizens of those countries don't feel comfortable going out in their own communities, in the streets of their cities, wearing yarmulkes or kippahs or wearing Jewish signage. So these are real issues of concern to us at ADL, and we take every step possible to both advocate with our own US government, and we hope that the Biden administration will be open to hearing that, and with governments around the world. And we continue the advocacy for that. As you all know, that the US government within the State Department has a specific office of the Special Envoy on Anti-Semitism. That's an office that we work very closely with. It is an outward-looking office. Its purview is really outside the US and looking at anti-Semitism outside. So we will be working again very closely with that office holder within the Biden administration and the State Department to really elevate the issues of concern to Jewish communities everywhere. I can keep going, but Tyler, tell me if there are any questions in queue that you want to go to, or else I can talk a little bit more about, Latin America, Europe, and the Middle East.
Thank you, Sharon. I think we would definitely like to hear that. We have received one question, though, and since we are talking about anti-Semitism and extremism, maybe it will be nice to jump into that quickly and then go back. So we got a question from Guillermo. He said that you mentioned the right-wing movements in terms of white supremacy. Can you give us a bit more context about the left-wing movements, specifically with regards to Black Lives Matter and Antifa and their views on anti-Semitism and the trends that you picked up over the election period, please?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm sure you all saw that the George Floyd killing in America was truly a moment, an inflection point in the US. So I'm starting with that because that's where the demonstrations that ensued and the creation of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was already there, but really reached an apex in the US. definitely the extremism that we monitor at ADL comes from all sides. I mentioned a little bit about right-wing extremists, but obviously left-wing extremism and Islamic extremism are concerns to us equally. So we go wherever we see it and we monitor, and we also ring the alarm bells when necessary. I can tell you that after September 11th in the US, where there was a huge attention on Islamic extremism in the US, we were part of monitoring and reporting on activities in the US and around the world. In the US, for the past, I would say since 9/11, our focus has shifted on white supremacist groups and extremism on the right, because we still to this day have found that the threats of violence, actual acts of violence, has really now continuing to emanate from the right-wing extremist groups. On the left, Antifa obviously became a huge source of interest and concern by many. The movement, which is not really a cohesive movement, it is not an organization, Antifa, it is the loose set of people, whether they're anarchists, whether they're ideologies or, kind of very broad spectrum of ideologies from left to radical left to anarchist, became a very big part of the last campaign, as well as we saw the demonstrations in the streets of major cities in the US take part, and really kind of the going head to head of what we could call extremists from the left and extremists from the right. The Black Lives Matter movement is a movement of social justice. And we at ADL have looked very closely to see whether there is a fair assessment of the Black Lives movement as in any way anti-Semitic. And while there have been instances and examples where that line has been crossed, whether specific chapters in some cities have taken the step of going over the line using both anti-Israel and anti-Semitic language, we have felt that as a Black Lives Matter movement as a whole, again, not an organization that is a unified organization, but they're different chapters in different cities. Their structural makeup is different. We feel that this is a social justice movement, and the anti-Semitism part of it is a very minor, secondary part of what the goal of this movement is. And only at certain circumstances or instances have we seen where it has taken an anti-Semitic bent. So for example, in Los Angeles, where I live, during the initial demonstrations and reaction to the George Floyd killing, we had really tremendous violence through the city of Los Angeles. And we did have one synagogue where it was marked with bad language. I won't repeat it on the air here, anti-Israel language, and also anti-Jewish language. So there were definitely certainly instances of anti-Semitic manifestations through the Black Lives Matter movement in some very limited cases. But we at ADL feel that generally speaking, the movement's focus is about racial justice, and it is about this inflection point in America in addressing institutional racism that is part of our society and that needs to be addressed. So when it comes to, we try not to compare, but again, just to tell you a bottom line is that we feel at ADL that the physical threat and violence that is apparent is still coming primarily from right-wing extremist groups, as we saw in Poway, San Diego, the synagogue that was attacked, as we saw in Pittsburgh, as there were many, many cases in Muncie, in New York and New Jersey, especially the end of 2019, where there were a spate of attacks. So if we were to use indicators such as actual acts of violence, it is really more than any sector or any ideological perspective, it is the right-wing extremists that are partaking in acts of violence. And that's why a lot of our focus is there. But globally speaking, for example, what happened in the UK in the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn is a much more systemic anti-Semitism that was made apparent, and Jeremy Corbyn kind of became the face of that institutional anti-Semitism that the Labour Party was hijacked with. Thankfully today, with the new leadership in the Labour Party in the UK, with Steimer taking over, the reports that were just released within the last month, really acknowledging, recognizing the institutionalization of anti-Semitism in the UK Labour Party. We think that's actually some of the good news in 2020 that's come about out of the UK, where some of those real embedded institutional anti-Semitism in the Labour Party is being addressed. The Jewish community of UK is very pleased with the movement and the direction that things are going. So that's, I think, on the left, probably the UK is the best example. And I think, for you in South Africa and in other countries where BDS and the delegitimization of Israel is really coming from the left. And we have that in the US as well. We have it on campuses. We have it in the US Congress, attempts to bring BDS even at the municipal levels. But again, if you compare in terms of violent acts, we're still thankfully not seeing that from the left, but doesn't mean there's no concern there. There's definitely concern. Tyler, I hope that answers that question. I would like to speak a little bit. Yeah, are there other questions, or can I talk a little bit about kind of going around the world and
I think let's go into that. Thank you.
All right. So I want to start with Latin America, because that's the region of the world that both in the US and maybe for you all in South Africa doesn't get as much attention, and yet is really actually fascinating, the changes that are happening there. Keep in mind that what we're all experiencing right now, this global pandemic, has been a kind of an equalizer, right? We're all under the same pressures. We're all concerned about the same threats, whether it's economic, joblessness, and economic instability going forward. And just to kind of, before I dive into Latin America, when at the onset of the pandemic, one thing that my team did is literally we set up calls with every single Jewish community around the world, and we tried to discern what are shared experiences and shared concerns. And right away with the pandemic, what we noticed is there are a few very, very common themes that really was shared by all Jewish communities around the world. First and foremost, that thankfully, no Jewish community felt that the pandemic was something that was unique to the Jewish community. This was a shared experience where the whole society they lived in was experiencing it and was experiencing it together. Secondarily, the biggest concern of all communities was economic. What will the economic mayhem that basically lies ahead and has already started to be felt throughout cities and countries around the world, what impact will that have on the general population? And then will that then turn into kind of looking for scapegoats, looking for communities to blame? And we know throughout our Jewish history that unfortunately Jewish minorities in many countries are the first community to be blamed when there is huge economic fluctuation, when there's huge economic downturn, when there's huge numbers of out of work citizens. So that was one theme that really was shared across the board, where all communities felt that with economic downturns, there would be a rise in anti-Semitism. And then thirdly, we saw one pattern which was interesting, but thankfully short-lived. In those countries and cities where there were large ultra-Orthodox communities, so Jews who are visibly Jewish, at the outset, there was this tug and pull, and I'm sure you felt it also in Cape Town, where some of the ultra-Orthodox communities were not at the beginning adhering to the medical and recommendations for the lockdown. They were more reluctant to pay attention to it. And at the same time, because of that, they're also attracting more attack and criticism by the general population in their cities. So we saw that in Brussels, in Canada, I think, in the US, definitely in New York and New Jersey, in Israel, in Bnei Brak. There was a specific attention to the ultra-Orthodox communities, and Tyler, you tell me, and Stuart, in Cape Town, if this was an experience where the ultra-Orthodox community was singled out, and we were very concerned that they would become a target of anti-Semitic attacks because of that misunderstanding and lack of alignment, let's call it. But thankfully, I think after a couple of months of the pandemic, those issues were resolved. And really what was left was this global fear of rising anti-Semitism, rising extremism, populism kind of taking effect in many, many countries, and people being more prone to conspiracy theories, to blaming the Jews for the virus, or blaming why is Israel at the forefront of coming up with a vaccine. They must have been behind the virus to begin with. So conspiracy theories really became a huge common denominator in many, many countries and many societies. And the Jewish community suffered for it and had to pay the price for it. Going now to Latin America, obviously Latin America is a very diverse region with many countries and very large Jewish populations, like in Argentina and Brazil, and some very, very small communities, like in Guatemala and Colombia and other places. So we saw a kind of diversity of reaction to the rising economic nervousness and anxieties, but the communities all were saying the same thing, that we are worried about our Jewish institutions bearing the pressure of economic upheaval, our communities being left with more food insecurity, medical insecurity, but also at the same time, really coming together and becoming even stronger. That was really a theme that we've seen, maybe globally as well, where the resilience of these communities have come together and have emboldened and strengthened the communal life in many, many countries. I mean, I'll just point out Chile. Chile is a country that has a small Jewish community. At the same time, has a very large, almost 400,000 Palestinian Chilean community that emigrated to Chile, over 100 years ago. And for most of that time, there's been very good relations between the Chilean and between the Jewish and the Palestinian Chilean communities. Over the last 2 decades, the Jewish community has noticed a real radicalization and politicization of the Palestinian community, where they really imported a lot of the Middle East Arab-Israeli conflict issues to Chile. And the Palestinian community in Chile, for example, has a very large imprint in government, in their parliament, in their business world. And I think very similar to your experience in South Africa, the Jewish community is held responsible for policies coming out of the Middle East, coming out of Israel. So BDS, delegitimization of Israel, really taking all the narrative and language from the Israel-Palestine conflict and importing it and holding the Jewish community responsible for it. So I think if I were to compare 2 communities around the world that kind of share an experience when it comes to anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, maybe the Chilean community might be closer to your South African experience. And I know that that's really an issue both on university campuses, across South Africa, and something that I hear a lot from Stuart and Tyler and others. Stuart, I don't know if you want to jump in here and kind of tell me a little bit about this dichotomy, of this comparison between a country like Chile and South Africa.
So I just want to pay tribute. I see Wendy Khan is on the call. There's no doubt. I mean, I think what you've explained with these 2 communities does echo a lot. I think what COVID has done, especially for the Cape Town community, has definitely got us to be far more out of our silos, and all the communal organizations are working hand in hand. When this broke on March the 13th in Cape Town, one of the first things that we had to do was really organize ourselves. We were the first school, and it came from a Jewish day school, that closed. And really, I think we as the Jewish community reacted far quicker than our national government. And tribute also to our national body and Wendy and her father and the medical professionals who really created a system and a structure. And I think maybe in the sense on the religious, more ultra-Orthodox community, we might have had 1 or 2 concerns, but generally I think the structure, putting in the work streams, the medical, the welfare work streams, the schools, the synagogues, getting everybody connected and working together cohesively has obviously seen us come out. I think the work the National Board did on outreach and reaching out into South Africa, as well as coming out and making a statement to support the Chinese community and other minority communities are attacked. I think all of this work has really strengthened the South African Jewish community and ensured that we positioned ourselves in the right way. Listen, this battle isn't over. Sharon, you raised things around the JCS, which is Jewish Care Services here in Cape Town. We are feeding more and more Jews. More and more Jews are becoming indigent. So the need for creating more funds to support Jews, not only in creating job opportunities, getting their kids through a Jewish day school, ensuring they're fed. These are all challenges we feel. I suppose down in Cape Town, where we have a rather large Muslim community, we do feel that decisions made in Israel have a massive effect on our campuses, on our Jews who walk here. One thing I am proud of is that Jews in South Africa can still wear their yarmulkes and their tzitzis out and their Jewish identity. We do have the odd cases from time to time, but the partnership between ADL and our national board and us, we've been able to tackle these when they've happened and deal with the issues. So definitely there are some close similarities and ties between these communities.
So just giving you another example, what you said about the role of the Jewish community in South Africa being almost ahead of the government, this was also very true in the case of Mexico and the Mexican Jewish community, where they were literally leading the way for the government and for other national authorities to understand what steps they needed to take to get a hold of kind of the reaction, as national reaction to COVID. And so the Mexican Jewish community did a tremendous job, both with their medical leadership and communally, kind of setting the standards of wearing masks, staying at home. And it's really tremendous to see how Jewish communities around the world have been on the forefront of some of the solutions and the steps that need to be taken in their own community. So that was really fantastic. I'm happy to hear that you in Cape Town have also played that role. So, I mean, going around the world, the Biden administration will be to us, hopefully a more uniting force now. When we look at Europe, for example, which is for ADL and for my team, probably the region of the world of biggest concern, where we see kind of all these, like I call it the triple storm, you know, rising extremism from the right, definitely rising extremism, also on the left, as we saw under Corbyn. Hopefully that'll be under more control, and definitely rising Islamist threats. We've seen now just in the last few months in Paris, in Vienna, multiple physical attacks and terrorist acts coming. We hope that with the Biden administration engaging with our allies further, this topic of addressing extremism too will be a top priority. And I can tell you that we will be raising that and advocating for that in every way that ADL can, with our own government and my team, with definitely governments across Europe. They're also important allies when it comes to fighting groups like Hezbollah. I mean, just the labeling of Hezbollah as a terrorist organization has been something that you've seen now initially started with Germany and other governments acknowledging and labeling Hezbollah as a terrorist group. So this is the kind of work that ADL does on a daily basis. I know that we all advocate with our own governments for that designation. I don't know if that's even an issue in South Africa. It's even brought up. But for sure, we are going to continue to bear pressure on the rest of Europe and Latin America, and hopefully across Africa and the Middle East, for these very important designations that label terrorist groups like as Hezbollah as what they should be, and therefore limiting their ability to move money around, their ability to really intervene in societies as they do in Latin America, as I mentioned, the Triple Frontier, working with narco traffic, really a lot of nefarious activities that should be limited. So having those designations, it actually limits them in really profound ways. So that's part of kind of our advocacy work that we'll continue to do with the new administration in the US, and hoping that we'll have a good partnership to do that.
And thank you for that global perspective. If we can maybe just stick with the US, I want to know, given the late Chief Rabbi Sachs referred to anti-Semitism as the world's first warning sign of a major threat to freedom, humanity, and the dignity of difference, and what you have said in the rise of anti-Semitism globally and the tension you've described with minority communities in the US with attacks on synagogues, Jewish centers, and even destruction of churches. Do you see Biden and his VP Harris bringing national unity to the US? Or do you project that because of the pandemic, because of the economic uncertainty, given that we know socioeconomic instability does increase discrimination, do you see it continuing to escalate and impacting minority communities globally?
So I think there's no doubt that the messaging coming out of President-elect and Vice President-elect has been one of unifying the country. I think at every opportunity that President-elect Biden's had, he has to really tried very hard to put out a message that I am the president for all of Americans, even if you didn't vote for me. So he has definitely taken very concrete steps and really strong attempts to say that I want to be the kind of president that unifies our country rather than divides us. Now, does that mean does that put an end to the actual division within the US? And I would say no. All the groups and all the sentiment that led to 7 million Americans voting for President Trump showed that there was no repudiation of or rejection of the ideologies that was behind the kind of the Trump ideology, if we want to call it that. So the extremist groups that built their own views about what America should look like, what America should be, and used the Trump leadership as the perfect embodiment of that, are still there. And if anything, they will probably feel more emboldened to continue their efforts and to fight not only against this administration, but fight on the streets and fight in our communities in everyday life to say that we still feel that our ideology is the right one. And whether it's one of, non-replacement, a lot of the white nationalist groups are worried about being replaced by minority communities in America. The demographics are against them. They feel a loss of power. They feel that they're being what's called the great replacement, that they've been replaced as the main power group within the US. All of that has only gotten stronger and will continue. So we at ADL are very concerned about the continued engagement activity of these groups, and not only growing larger, but getting more mainstreamed. So we're seeing this kind of rhetoric being accepted in our Congress, being accepted on regular media outlets. So the permeation and seeping in of those kinds of rhetorics, narratives, and language is very concerning to us, and we don't think that's going to stop. So on one hand, the messaging coming out of the leadership will hopefully help, but the challenges remain, and if anything, might get more acute in some ways. We are very concerned about, as we monitor the chat rooms and continue to listen in to some of these extremist groups, we definitely don't see them, stepping back. If anything, they're leaning in.
Thank you.
So Sharon and Tyler, if I can come in now. So it looks like we've got a comment from Wendy Khan, our National Director. I want to acknowledge and thank the ADL for their incredible support of South African jury. They make themselves available to us on an ongoing basis. It's so reassuring to know someone has our back. Thank you, Sharon, and your phenomenal team. And I want to echo those words from the Cape Regional Office. The ADL says in its mantra, fighting hate for good. We in Cape Town believe, and it came out of President Biden's speech when he accepted the president, he quoted Etta Baker, who was a civil rights and human rights activist. Give light and people will find the way. Today, more than ever, organizations like the ADL and the South African Jewish Board of Deputies and the Cape South African Jewish Board of Deputies, by stepping up to fight hate, to call it out when we see it, by making sure we watch the trends, we ensure that we don't become that budgie in the coal mine, as they say. We live in a divisive world. The American election has showed that. Nearly 72.3 million Americans voted for Trump and his policy. And I think at the end of the day is when we have divisiveness, we need to call it out, but we need to fight for good. There is a lot of work still to be done. And so Sharon, just on behalf of all of us here in South Africa and Cape Town, we do want to thank you for taking the time in Los Angeles. I know it's probably early morning there, but for taking the time and making yourself available to come and address us and talk to us. We really do appreciate it, and for always being willing to share your educational content and your material that has such an effect on our students and our community here in Downs in South Africa. And, you know, we might only be 14,000, but we are so grateful for everything you do. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Wendy. It's a warm hello and regards to all of you. And I'm happy to come back anytime. And I hope next time in person. I would love to visit and see you all and do an in-person visit. Thank you for having me today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sharon. That is definitely something we will look forward to. And thank you again to all our attendees for joining us. We will be sharing the recording from tonight on our Facebook page. If you would like to find out more about ADL and the work that they do, register via their website at www.adl.org for their virtual Never Is Now Summit on Anti-Semitism and Hate, which is on until the 19th of November. Goodbye, everyone. Good night.